By late autumn, the nights came quickly, as if the sun were a tired animal finding its den earlier each day. The marsh turned the color of old brass. On some evenings, fog arrived from the river in a single confident piece, like a curtain being pulled across a stage. People learned to speak closer, softer, shorter. Plans shrank their footprints and lengthened their reach. Hester's baskets began to travel farther than market stalls. A Warwick cousin took one upriver. A Caldwell aunt carried another to a neighbor whose husband loved to boast and hated to notice details. The baskets looked like gifts and were gifts, but they were also sentences. Curves that said stay and knots that said move, and a certain tightness that meant not yet. Hester understood that work like this asks for humility. A message must be clear enough for the right eyes and ordinary enough to look like nothing to everyone else. She rewove the rim 3 times on a cold night until the meaning felt like it would hold. Mira's string of knots grew longer, and then shorter, and then longer again as roots opened and closed. She began wearing it beneath her sleeve, where it warmed against her skin and reminded her that memory can be carried without being seen. One afternoon she traded 2 eggs for a slate that a child in the main house had cracked at the corner and declared ruined. Mira ran a wetted finger across it, wrote numbers that were not numbers, and smiled to herself. Later, when the slate disappeared from the shelf where she had hidden it, she did not panic. In her head, the numbers had already turned into steps and shadows and timing. The slate was only a rehearsal, and the performance was inside her. Kojo at the docks had a talent for becoming the right kind of visible. On days when patrols wanted to make an example, he made himself someone whose labor would be missed if interrupted, a man holding the far end of a rope that kept a heavy thing from falling on a captain's pride. On nights when messages needed carrying, he became a shadow that jokes with other shadows about wages and weather, then slips away to whistle a tune into a stairwell. People began to say he knew the harbor like a priest knows his prayer book, not as a set of words, but as a set of doors you can open in the dark. Kofi, the imported hammer, did his rounds with a face that told no one what he felt, because feelings had been taken from him once and he'd had to grow new ones crooked. He started visiting the smithy on an errand Silas Trent approved, inspection of chains. The smith, an old man named Darius with a shoulder that clicked when it rained, had been burning iron long enough to understand that heat admits truth. He noticed the way Kofi held a length of chain, not like a man pleased by its promise, but like a man measuring the distance between 2 hard facts. Darius set down his tongs and said, "That link's a fraction thinner than the others." "Patched in a hurry." Kofi nodded once. "Sometimes a fraction is the whole story," he answered. They stood a minute in the warm, hammer-soft air, sharing an understanding that did not require a plan yet and would, in time. On a Sunday, a preacher visited from 2 parishes over, a spare man with a voice like a saw, not pretty, but it went straight through wood. He spoke of Exodus because men with whips always make Exodus relevant, and then he did something unusual. He sang a line that had no words, just a bending, note that rose and fell and rose again, and he held it long enough that people felt their own breath become a bridge between bodies and a ladder to something they could not name. When the line ended, he said, "Some truths do not want syllables. Some truths want a sound." Ada closed her eyes and saw the furnace in a woman's mouth forming a sentence that had become a continent. That week brought 2 kinds of visitors to the Caldwell lands. The first came with papers and questions, a magistrate's aide with a laugh tuned for parlors, not kitchens. He stood on the porch and announced that the governor was tired of whispers and would like them to stop at once, the way a child might tell rain to cease. The second visitor arrived at midnight without a knock, a girl whose face had traveled farther than her feet. She had slept in 5 places in 6 nights and could not stop counting. Hester put a hand on her cheek and felt a fever that was not fever but fear practiced too long. She set water to heat, laid a cloth on the floor, and whispered a question that meant, "How much have you told the air already?" The girl touched her throat and shook her head. Nothing. She had saved her voice to spend it here. Hester nodded and began to spend hers carefully in return. Silas Trent felt time running at his heels. He had burned through 3 maps and 4 sets of suspicions without catching a single person who would satisfy his employer's need for display. He visited a man in town who sold information the way other men sold rugs: overprices for the desperate, discounts for old friends. The man, Mr. Pritchard, lived above his shop with 2 canaries that knew how to sing compliments. Pritchard told Silas, "Buy an informer inside a kitchen. They eat the same bread as everyone else. They can smell who is hungry." Silas left with a sense of mission and the wrong candidate in mind. He chose a boy who craved approval instead of a woman who needed bread. The boy tried and failed and wept under questions. The women closed ranks by doing nothing unusual, which is a hard discipline to maintain when you are angry and proud. The sealed records in Charleston might have slept another generation, if not for a small accident. A roof leak in the archives that sent a thin finger of water down a wall and into a box of papers. A young assistant, no one of consequence yet, found the damp, lifted the lid, and saw the edges of a governor's order ripple. He dried the box with care, then did what curious people do. He read 1 line more than he had permission to read. In the matter of the incident at Grayfield, the order began, and the assistant felt the room lean slightly toward him, as if the past were tired of holding its own weight. He closed the box, returned it to its shelf, and walked to the harbor to stare at the water until perspective reassembled itself. The next day he handed in his resignation and signed on as a clerk on a ship bound for ports with different shadows. Years later, in a city where the street names sang in a language he never learned to argue with, he would tell a woman in a red scarf about the box, and she would nod as if confirming a weather report. Yes, fog again. Meanwhile, Ada's yard had become a station in a network that didn't call itself anything. She kept no list. She kept instead a sequence of gestures: how she set her broom against the doorframe if a patrol had passed, how she stacked wood if a road was watched, how she hummed when the way was clear. Mira added a pattern with the laundry: 3 shirts and a gap and then 2, meaning an early dawn, or 2 shirts and a gap and then 3, meaning a late dusk. Hester began to make a stew on nights when someone must be hidden, because stew forgives additions and doesn't mind being stirred too long. Jonah, who had crossed the river with Kojo's help and then crossed 3 more borders with help no paper recorded, returned north as quietly as a cloud. He wore his hair short, his mouth in a line that promised nothing and implied everything. In St. Augustine, a woman with a ledger had taught him how to read not only letters but people. The way a liar blinks fast, the way a generous man puts his hands on a table, the way a cruel person always acts as if time owes him change. He came back carrying nothing anyone could seize and everything he needed. He came back because the network had grown a branch that could not be pruned from afar. He went first to the docks. Kojo saw him and did not smile. They shared a look like men who had both watched a fire and carried water. "You know the notes now?" Kojo asked. Jonah whistled 3 that meant "I am a friend who has come to help," and 2 that meant "I will leave at once if this is a bad night." Kojo nodded. "Then you know enough to begin." They began with a plan the size of a loaf of bread. On a Tuesday when the market thrummed and patrols risked complaints by pushing too hard through the crowd, Kojo guided a new arrival, a woman with a boy who wouldn't let go of her shirt, between stacks of barrels to a door that looked like it belonged to no one. Jonah opened the door from the inside, lifted the boy under the arms, and said, "You are very heavy. Your bones must be made of brass." The boy giggled despite terror, and the sound changed the room. Inside, a seamstress named Tilda sat with a pile of mending and a pot of tea and the kind of eyes that can make a person remember they are alive. She made the woman drink, placed a slice of bread in the boy's hand, and asked the room in a voice the patrol would never hear. "How far?" "Half a day," the woman said. "And a lifetime?" Tilda nodded and threaded a needle. "Half a day is easy," she said. "A lifetime is work for tomorrow." Kofi and Darius the smith made a study of chains together without saying they were doing so. Darius began to repair links that did not need repair, replacing them with iron that had a mind of its own. Soft where hardness would have done harm, hard where softness would have given way. He taught Kofi to see the place where a cut would matter least to a body, and most to a shackle. Kofi taught Darius to listen to the silence before a patrol's horse whinnies, a silence that means a rider has pulled the reins and decided to stop a moment longer for nothing good. One evening, as the light went thin, Darius held up a length of chain and said, "If you lift here, the strain goes there. If you lift there, the strain goes nowhere." Kofi grunted. So we lift nowhere. It wasn't philosophy. It was physics, and it would save 2 wrists before winter ended. Silas Trent watched these movements and saw only his own frustration. He crafted a show of strength, a raid timed for a Sunday evening when people would be fatigued from worship and less careful. He chose the Warwick kitchen because rumor painted it lively. He arrived with 4 men, a dog, and a lantern that burned too hot. The dog found nothing, which made Silas angrier, and anger made him clumsy, and clumsiness made him dangerous. He kicked a stool, grabbed a pot, and threw it against the hearth. The lid popped off. Steam rose, carrying beans and garlic, and a comfort that made his men look embarrassed to be there. A woman laughed just once, a tiny sunrise of sound. Silas rounded on her. Hester stepped forward, fingers open at her sides, spine straight the way Ada had taught her, and said, "Sir, the stew needed stirring anyway." The men snorted, pretending they were not amused. The dog lay down by the door and placed its head on its paws, disappointed in the company it kept. After that foolish raid, Warwick's household pretended to be calmer. Pretend can be protection. It can also be mask and bait. 2 weeks later, the butler who had leaned the broom in the secret angle came to Hester at dawn, hands shaking as if someone had set him to vibrate. "They are sniffing around the pantry again," he said. "The closet panel, gone. They replaced the catch. They count forks like they expect them to multiply overnight." Hester fixed him with a look that was not unkind. "Then our house is closed for a while," she said. "We feed only bellies here. No one feeds fear." The butler swallowed. He had expected a grand plan with fireworks. What he received was more useful, restraint. He nodded and wrung his hands, and then, because he needed to do something with them, washed all the cups with a care that approached prayer. Down the river, a different house decided to become useful. The Fairfax property had never been part of the network. Its mistress disliked company that did not arrive with letters, and its master prized a kind of cold order that made help feel unwelcome. But the cook, a tall woman named Dinah with a laugh that sounded like a ladle striking a pot, took in a cousin's child who needed hiding between one afternoon and the next. She made up a bed behind the flour barrels and taught the child to hold still whenever the pantry door opened. She taught the child to scratch the itch and keep the scratch quiet. She taught the child to breathe through linen. These are skills as important as knowing roots, and Dinah taught them with gentleness, which is not less effective than terror but does take more patience. Jonah started keeping a list in his head of the bravest people he knew, and it surprised him how many of them were cooks. He told Kojo as much one night while they sat on a coil of rope and shared a wedge of cheese. Kojo chewed and nodded. "Fire teaches," he said. "If you stand before it long enough, you learn what it demands and what it gives. Men who avoid kitchens never learn. That's why they burn so easily when the time comes." Jonah looked toward the harbor where the masts made a forest of far-traveled trees. "Some men burned," he said softly. "Others are learning to feel heat." Kojo flicked cheese rind into the water and watched a fish claim it. "Let them learn," he said. "We have lessons to deliver." The Spanish thread pulled tighter. A new priest, young, shy in the way of men who are fierce at the right hour, added a detail to the list written in plain sight. He wrote, "For travelers, if you arrive to find the gate painted yesterday, ask for St. Mateo's water." That meant the guard had changed. The safe hand had gone. "Wait a day." He also wrote, "If figs are not good this week, ask whether the cheese is better," which meant a new route inland had been arranged. The woman in the red scarf trained a boy to whistle the welcome notes and a girl to answer them from the roof with a different phrase if danger stood in the alley. The boy practiced until neighbors cursed him good-naturedly. The girl practiced until Wind stopped noticing her. One stormy night, Kofi stood in the smithy with Darius as rain made music on the roof. Darius's shoulder clicked and clicked. "You should rest that," Kofi said. Darius chuckled. "I told it to rest years ago. It doesn't listen." He lifted a shackle and brought the hammer down with a finality that sounded like judgment. "There," he said. "Now the weak place is here, where an ignorant man won't catch it, and the strong place is here where a friend will know it's safe to pull." Kofi ran a thumb over the iron and felt gratitude travel up his arm. He wasn't a man who thanked easily. "You do good work," he said. Darius snorted. "I do what can be done with what's in front of me." He looked at Kofi. "You do the same." Silas Trent's health began to show the cost of living in a posture of suspicion. He slept poorly. He ate without tasting and drank without pleasure. He snapped at men who would later be asked to protect him, and at women whose kindness he mistook for trickery. He wrote longer reports that explained less. He told Mr. Caldwell, "We are surrounded by a conspiracy," as if the land itself had tilted against him. Mr. Caldwell, who had begun to doubt the wisdom of hiring a man whose eyes never rested, said he would be reassessing expenditures in the spring. Silas went home and stared at the wall and saw not a wall but the shape of a furnace he had never stood before. He lit a candle and watched it burn down too fast. We could say the world teetered then, and it did, but not toward a single cliff. It teetered toward many small choices, a door opened or not, a bowl filled full or skimmed, a horse led by the bridle or slapped on the flank in anger, a hymn sung 2 beats longer than the page allows. Those choices assembled themselves into a path. The path never looked like a parade. It looked like ordinary life practiced with uncommon care. Then came an evening that wanted to become legend. Not a Grayfield-scale legend, but one big enough to make patrols rethink the meaning of routine. On the River Hartwell Road, a wagon loaded with saltfish hit a rut and broke an axle, which would have been the end of the story most days. The driver, an old white man with hands that had learned to hurt and then later learned to bandage, shouted and swore. People gathered because saltfish draws a crowd. Among them stood Jonah, hat low, and Hester with a basket she pretended was heavy, and a boy who had learned to wind himself like a spring and release precisely when needed. Kofi appeared with a length of chain and an offer of help that sounded like a favor to the driver, and was also cover for the work that must be done behind the wagon where eyes did not reach. Under the fish lay a false bottom. Under the false bottom lay a woman and 2 children breathing carefully, listening for the cue they had practiced. The sound of 3 knocks that meant the road had forgotten patrols for 1 minute. The knocks came. The boy with spring legs flung himself under the wagon, slid the panel and handed up one child and then the other to Hester, whose basket, now revealed as a prop, held nothing but a cloth and 2 small cups. She placed the children in a circle of bodies that turned into a wall without looking like one. Jonah took the woman's hand and said, "We will be plain as daylight," and walked with her down the center of the road as if they were exactly what they seemed, late for a chore. Kofi kept the driver busy saying how an axle might be bandaged until help came. The driver, slower than he'd been in his younger days, did not see the wagon become lighter and the road become wider, and his luck become better than deserved. By the time the patrol turned the corner, people were arguing in good humor about whether the axle should be splinted with green wood or old. Patrolmen dislike entering arguments they do not understand. They told the driver to move as if moving were something he had not considered. He tipped his hat and said, "Would if I could." They rode on, legs stiff with self-importance, and the woman and her children reached a lane that had learned how to swallow footsteps. Later at Ada's, the children slept in a pile like puppies and the woman drank water as if remembering herself sip by sip. Hester sat by the door with a knife across her lap, not as threat but as ritual. Mira whispered numbers into her string and then tucked it away. Kojo, leaning in the doorway like a man who had been born there, told a joke quiet enough for only 3 people to hear. Kofi stood at the edge of the light and looked at his hands the way a man looks at tools that are finally being used for their right purpose. Jonah slipped out before gratitude could make him soft because he had learned that soft is for dawn, not for night. Not every night ended this way. Some ended with loss that could not be named aloud because naming asks for answers. A woman disappeared between two safe doors and neither door was wrong. A boy caught fever from sleeping too close to a river on a cold fall night, because the house marked for him had been watched at the wrong hour. A man decided he was brave enough to go alone and wasn't. The network carried those names too. Not as warnings only, but as a charge. Be more careful. Be more accurate. Be more patient. Be more stubborn, and still, under everything, the sentence worked its slow work. People repeated it without feeling theatrical. They used it the way a carpenter uses a square, to check whether the thing he is making will stand. Justice burns slower than coal, but burns complete. The slowness trained their hands. The completeness held their hearts. Far away from kitchens and marsh, the sealed records cured in their boxes like wood in a kiln. Paper ages, but the meaning pressed into it does not die so much as join the air. Scholars who would come later would argue dates and names and cite the governor and his order, the clerk and his neat hand, the years between. But the truth did not need their footnotes to keep breathing. It lived where it had always lived, in the people who remade a dangerous place into a narrower danger and then, sometimes, into a refuge. That winter, snow did not fall. It rarely does there, but a frost crept into shallow places and wrote its script on leaves and fence rails. Mira ran her finger along a frozen rim and felt the world say, "See, even I can burn slow and go complete in my own way. Ice writes, then melts, then feeds the root." She laughed at herself at the vanity of thinking the earth was lecturing. Then she laughed again when Ada across the yard called, "Yes, it talks. Listen better." They smiled at each other over the space between their jokes and their truth. In the months to come, the circle would widen. The Spanish thread would thicken. The men in coats would write new codes that broke in new places. And a fire would start in a town not far away and light corners that had never been lit. But for now, the work was this. A basket rim made clear. A string of knots rehearsed. A chain whose weak place was known by the right hands. A stew that forgave the lateness of hungry guests. A dog fed just enough to choose friendliness over duty. A hymn bent one note lower to say, "Wait, wait, now." The year turned the way a book turns, not all at once, but with a whisper that becomes a crease and then a new page. In that turning, small certainties arrived. Certain doors would always stick in wet weather. Certain patrols would always stop to gossip at a particular sycamore. Certain dogs preferred bread to duty. Certain men preferred fear to thought. The network learned these truths the way hands learn calluses, without ceremony by use. Ada's yard took on the calm of places that are secretly busy. In daylight, baskets and laundry. At dusk, voices like soft drills. At night, footfalls braided into silence. Hester watched the path from the lane as if it were a sentence that might change meaning at any comma. Mira drifted through the house counting without looking as if counting. Steps to the door. Beats between knocks. Breaths it takes to cross the room when the moon is thin. Tamar, who spoke less the more he knew, fixed a hinge that had begun to squeal because squeals tell stories to the wrong ears. The priest in St. Augustine sent out a new message in plain sight. He wrote, "Blessed are those who travel by the old road, for the Lord is in the shade as well as the sun." Anyone reading for comfort would find it. Anyone reading for roots would find a note tucked neatly inside. The inland path is open again, the coastal lane watched. The woman in the red scarf took in the news with an expression that was almost boredom, the practiced look of a person for whom calm is a weapon. She taught her son to play a tune on a penny whistle that sounded like a song children sing while skipping rope. When he played it fast, it meant danger. When he played it slow, it meant rest. Kojo had begun to mark people by the look in their shoulders, how they carried what they could not put down. From a distance he could tell a new arrival from a sailor, a deserter from a man-hunting work, a hunter from the hunted. He never called out the hunted by name. He drifted into their path with a phrase about weather and the price of salt, and let them choose whether to answer with the countersign, "Clouds look heavy," or "Salt holds its price unless it gets wet." If they answered correctly, he would say, "Then we must find shelter." Shelter, in his mouth, meant a door someone had already prepared to open. One late afternoon, a ship came in heavy and late, its rigging scolding the wind for not being more helpful. On the deck stood a thin man with eyes like a ledger, columns, rows, additions, and next to him a barrel that did not ring right when tapped. Kojo watched the barrel's journey to the dock, then watched the thin man watch it, then watched a patrolman watch both. Watching is labor. It taxes the body. Kojo breathed slowly to keep his attention a live thing. When the barrel rolled past a shadowed door, a hand reached out, touched its rim, and smudged it with a trace of ash. Not much, just enough to tell a friend, this one. Kojo turned his body so that his shoulder bumped the barrel, sending it toward a corner where two other barrels waited like old cousins. The thin man snapped, "Careful!" with a paper knife voice. Kojo grinned. "Careful's my middle name." It wasn't, but he made the word sound true enough to be honored by the barrel. That night, the barrel sat in a shed that had once held nets, and now held more complicated weavings. Jonah arrived without footsteps and cut the hoops with a patience that told his hands to love each metal ring, even as he asked it to release. Inside, a woman unfolded herself from the curve where she had forced breath to be small and steady for half a day. Her first words were not about fear or thanks. "Water," she said, and Tilda was already there with a cup. Later, when her voice returned to her, she asked, "Do you know the sentence?" Jonah nodded. He said it quietly, and for a moment the shed held the sound like a cup holds water. Justice burns slower than coal, but it burns complete. The woman set the cup down. "Then I am in the right place," she said simply. Kofi's work with Darius deepened the way friendship can deepen without ever calling itself that. They spoke iron and silence. They spoke hinge and strike and temper. One morning Darius wrapped a bundle in rough cloth and handed it across the anvil. Inside lay two tools that were not quite tools and not quite keys, pieces that knew how to talk to locks made by men who thought of locks as final. "For the places where patience fails," Darius said. Kofi weighed them in his hands and felt something lift in his chest that he would not name as hope. Not yet. "For the places where hurry fails, we'll need other answers," he said. Darius smiled with his eyes. "We always do." Silas Trent, pressured by Mr. Caldwell and haunted by his own shadow, planned a raid that would prove he was worth his wage. He chose Ada's yard because he had watched the calm and mistaken it for a cover, rather than a cultivated truth. He chose Wednesday because the market drained people's attention on Wednesdays. He chose the hour after moonrise because he had learned somewhere that surprise loves that hour. He gathered 6 men and a dog that had learned to dislike him. He laid out his plan in a voice that cracked only once. Ada's yard read the air long before the knock. The broom leaned outward, no. The woodpile's top log lay at a diagonal, danger. Mira's laundry had become a code, 2 shirts and then 3 late patrols. Hester pulled the stew from the fire and hid the pot in an ash box that smelled too much like yesterday to interest a nose trained for today. Tamar untied the back latch and slid a shelf 2 inches. Left. One of those adjustments that means everything, if you know it is there, and nothing if you do not. The knock came with the arrogance of men who think wood belongs to their knuckles. Ada opened without hurry because hurry convinces a bully he was right. Silas stepped through with a lantern and the look of a man who needs to find a thing more than he needs it to be real. He planted himself in the center of the room as if the room were a territory to be claimed, and spoke as if he had practiced his tone in a glass. "We have reason to believe," he began, and Ada, who could match tone as easily as she could match thread, said, "You often do." The men tittered, surprised into a human response. Silas flushed. The dog sniffed a corner and sneezed, affronted by ash. They searched. They found nothing, because nothing was there to be found. The hidden shelf led to a crawl space where no one hid tonight. The pot in the ash box smelled of last week's meal. The bed under the flour barrels held flour, barrels, and the faintest ghost of a small girl's breath. Evidence is a jealous god. It demands absolute attention or none at all. Silas offered it attention and received nothing back. He turned to go and saw the knife on Hester's lap. "You keep that for what?" he asked. "For cutting," she said. "Everything else obeys words." He wanted to strike her because the world did not at this moment obey him. He didn't. Something in the room, maybe the quiet, maybe the dog's disinterest, held him by the sleeve. Out on the lane, after the men had gone, laughter traveled through the house the way a draft travels, fast, invisible, cooling. Ada let it pass and then called it back. Not for gloating, she said, for relief. Relief is a necessity. It empties the lungs so the next breath can be how it must. Hester set the knife aside and went to bring the stew back from the ash. Mira counted the steps to the door and back and cut one off because tonight they didn't need it. The raid had a cost anyway. The lane learned to tighten. The yard learned to breathe smaller. The dog, insulted by the evening, chose to find a new friend in Kojo who fed it sour crusts and praise. Silas wrote a report so bitter it read like a confession. Mr. Caldwell stopped reading after the second paragraph and began to wonder whether a man whose eyes never rested would ever see anything but ghosts. South along the old road, the Spanish network found strain and adapted. A new commander in the garrison disliked priests and set out to prove what discipline could do in a town that ran on mercy and trade. He counted doors, then counted them again, then demanded keys. Keys slipped away in the night and were found again in the morning by wives who argued persuasively and at length. The commander, unused to being out-argued by anyone but his own captain, took to inspecting chimneys for the fig-scented ash and found only lard smoke and patience. The woman in the red scarf began wearing blue on Tuesdays to indicate that time had changed shape. The boy's whistle found a new cadence. The girl on the roof learned a second answer. Networks thicken by learning to be many things. Jonah began something he had not done before. Training. Not a class, not a sermon, he was allergic to both, but a slow handing over. He chose 3 young people with different strengths. Abel, the wind in human form, Rose, the harmony that bent horses' ears, and a quiet boy named Leja, who could look at a field and tell you where the ground felt weak. Jonah walked with each of them not to teach them to be him, but to sharpen what they already were. You, he told Abel, must learn when to be a stone. You, he told Rose, must learn when not to sing. You, he told Leja, must learn when to choose the stronger ground even if it is not the shorter path. They nodded like students and then surprised him by improving his ideas. Abel learned to be still so fast it looked like a magic trick. Rose learned silence that tasted like a promise. Leja began to bring him better routes than he could have found alone. At the docks, a letter came folded into a scrap of song. Cojo hummed it, and Tilda wrote it down, and Jonah read it with his head tilted, as if the note would betray a tone he could not hear. It said in the priest's tidy hand, "A family of 5, 2 too small to walk far, 1 lame. Thursday dusk, Old Road. St. Mateo's water." Jonah closed his eyes a moment. 5 in one go is not a parade. It is a vow. He nodded and began the list the way a surgeon lays out instruments. Who, where, when, how. Then a second how in case the first dies in your hands. Thursday came with a sky like pewter and air that promised rain and delivered only mood. The old road looked exactly like itself. That is what old roads do. Then the family appeared at the bend. A woman carrying a girl, a man adjusting a boy on his hip, a grandmother taking the ground 1 steady inch at a time, and the lame child hobbling with patience and fury mixed. Jonah stepped from a sycamore's shadow as if he had grown there. "St. Mateo's water," he said. The woman's eyes went to the sky and back. "Bless it," she said, and the blessing sounded like both sarcasm and gratitude. They moved as if prosecuted by time, not fast, not slow, accurate. Abel went ahead to distract a patrol that loved distraction. Rose held the lame child's hand and talked about the sound rain makes when it remembers to fall, and the child's breath steadied to match her words. Elijah pointed his chin and said, "Not that ditch. It eats feet." And they avoided it and saved 5 minutes and a panic. Kofi, farther down the lane, took a chain from around a gate and let it drop as if it had slipped from his hand, which made the gate open just far enough for a body to pass without permission. Dinah, in a house not marked on any map, ladled stew into bowls for strangers because dinner for 5 is easier to hide in a smell than in silence. Neighbors accept stew smells at all hours. They reached Ada's yard at the exact minute that accuracy earns its name. The lane was empty on purpose. The room was warm but not hot because heat makes people careless with breath. Tamar set out cups like a soldier laying ammunition. Hester laid blankets where they would look like laundry if a lantern decided to misbehave. Mira counted. Not people but heartbeats. And when the room's rate slowed as it should, she let herself exhale the number she had been holding. Ada looked at the family with the assessing love of a woman who understands burdens and the speed at which they crush. "You are home for one night," she said. "Then you are gone." Kojo stood in the doorway with the dog and listened to a night that had finally chosen to be kind. He thought of the sentence and felt its truth warm his ribs like a good drink. Slower than coal, yes. Slower than the fear that runs ahead and trips you. Slower than the rage that burns itself out. But complete, too. Complete the way a circle always finds itself again no matter where you begin. Complete the way a song finds its chord at the end even after bending into strange keys. Complete the way the river joins the sea and says, "We were always going to meet." In Charleston, the young assistant who had fled the archives wrote a letter he did not send to a woman he had not met. He wrote, "I opened a box and a room moved. I left because I am not brave in the way a person must be to live with a moving room. Perhaps I am another kind of brave. Perhaps I am only sensible. But I hope the story that escaped that box never returns to it." He sealed the letter with a lump of wax he had in his pocket, then tore it in half because sometimes not sending is the truest message. Silas Trent, increasingly alone inside his skull, took to walking the old road at hours that made the night frown at him. He listened for conspiracies and heard owls. He listened for codes and heard frogs. He listened for footsteps and heard his own. Once he stopped at the sycamore and put his hand on the bark as if the tree might confess. It didn't. He muttered something about kitchens and treachery and tripped on a root. He caught himself and glared at the dark. "Cowards," he said, and the dark did not argue. The Fairfax cook Dinah decided that her pantry had room for a second bed. She did not ask permission because permission is a kind of theater that wastes time. She rearranged barrels and discovered a stronger shape. One that would not shift if a heavy hand banged the door. She taught the small girl who slept there to breathe through linen, and to imagine counting birds instead of soldiers when fear tried to measure her. She sent a loaf across the lane to Ada with 3 slashes on its crust, a mark that meant I am ready for more than I thought. Hester made a basket the size of a man's hope. It looked like a market basket, but its rim carried a tiny signature. 2 tight turns that no customer would see and every friend would. She filled it with nothing and carried it through town as if it carried everything. Patrols saw only a basket. Friends saw a wheel beginning to move. Mira's string changed again. She untied and retied 3 knots and felt the route shift under her fingers like a fish. She showed it to Elijah and he nodded as if he had been waiting for the alteration. "I felt the ground get softer there," he said. I didn't know how to say it. "This is how," she answered, and tapped the knot with her thumbnail. Jonah sat with Kojo and Kofi on a stack of planks and watched the harbor lights burn holes in the night. "There will be a turn," Jonah said, "when fear makes them reckless. We will need to be more careful and more bold at the same time." Kojo grunted, a sound that held agreement and the memory of a barrel lifted with aching arms. Kofi looked at his hands again, palms up. "I am learning patience," he said. "It tastes like iron in the mouth but sits warm in the belly." They were not men given to speeches. They let the silence be their vow. In the far distance, a different fire began. Not in a kitchen, and not of coal, but in minds that could no longer fit themselves into the shapes they'd been given. The stono drums were not yet beating, but the sticks had been cut, the skins stretched, the rhythms rehearsed in the bones of people who walked fields with backs that remembered other horizons. The Grayfield echo had reached them not as rumor alone, but as instruction. Power bleeds. Time is an ally if you train it. Heat obeys those who study it. The circle holds. Back on the river, the night closed like a book at the end of a chapter that wanted to keep going and finally allowed itself to stop. The family of 5 slept. The dog slept. The house held the shape of sleeping. Ada sat awake 1 hour longer than she needed to. Knife on the table, not because she expected a knock, but because she had learned in a kitchen once, without being there, that vigil is a form of love. When she finally slid the knife into its place and lay down, the last thought in her head was the one she taught to everyone who crossed her threshold. You belong to yourself. It is a sentence that takes practice. It is also a key. Morning would bring bread and maps and the old road stepping forward like a friend, and night would bring new plans written in stew and laundry and the angle of a broom. And between them the day would carry its ordinary work like a bright pail. Water in, water out, hands busy, minds precise. And over it all, as steady as the river's pull, the sentence kept its slow beat. Justice burns slower than coal, but burns complete. By early spring, the air smelled like wet rope and pine, and the old road looked exactly the way it always had. Ruts, puddles, a sycamore that kept its counsel, but the people moving along it had changed. They stepped like readers who now understood the book they were in. Tension tightened on both sides. In St. Augustine, the new commander's crackdowns arrived like badly aimed waves, loud, exhausting, failing to reach the shore he intended. Keys were demanded and replaced, doors were counted and miscounted, chimneys sniffed and missniffed. The woman in the red scarf turned her blue Tuesdays into blue and white when the gate guard swapped shifts, and the boy's whistle learned a third tempo that meant, wait a day more than you wish. Mercy was rerouted rather than silenced. North of the border, Ada's yard refined its ordinary brilliance. The broom's angle, the woodpile's top log, the laundry code. Tamar shaved the latch tongue on the back door until it could be lifted noiselessly with a spoon. Hester stitched 2 baskets with identical bodies and different rims, so that a friend could choose one in the market and select not produce but a path. Mira retied her string, one knot moved, one knot gone, one new knot added low where only a careful finger would find it. Cojo made friends of 2 dock dogs and insulted a third on purpose so it would bark at the wrong moments. Kofi and Darius finished 3 more knot keys for locks that believed in themselves too strongly. Jonah gathered Abel, Rose, and Legia and read the weather in their faces. Speed, quiet, ground, ready. The last cross-plantation run before the weather turned truly hot would test every thread. A mother with a newborn, a father whose hand shook since a beating, and a boy who had learned to stare men down and must now learn to lower his eyes. The letter came from the priest in plain sight. St. Mateo's water underlined, travel by shade underlined twice. Jonah divided the work, Cojo at the docks to misdirect, Dinah with the pantry, Kofi at the gate chain, Hester on the lane, Abel out front, Rose beside the boy, Legia choosing ground, Mira counting breaths, Ada holding the room's center the way a mason holds a curve until the arch finds itself. It began at dusk with the harmless bustle of a town eating and complaining and going on. Kojo stood where patrols liked to stand and pointed them toward a ship that had nothing to hide, and plenty of reasons to be looked at. He dropped a small rumor in the right ear, barrels of brandy not properly taxed, and watched 2 men chase the tax rather than the truth. Dinah slid a pot to the back of the hearth to free the front for water and cloth and the quiet work of easing a new mother through the hour. Kofi walked the perimeter with a thin coil of chain and a thicker coil of patience. Hester set a basket on her hip and made herself the kind of visible that turns questions into compliments. They met at the sycamore as planned, but the first crack appeared before anyone spoke. Silas Trent, whose pride had begun to eat him faster than fear ever could, stood 10 paces off with 2 men and a lantern turned low, listening as if he might hear a confession in the leaves. He had learned nothing and doubled down on it. Jonah saw him and did not change his pace. He walked straight toward Silas with the newborn's father at his shoulder and said, "Evening." There was no tremor in it. Silas stepped forward, trying to fill the road with his body. "Travelers," he said, dry as paper. "Where to?" Fairfax sighed. Jonah answered, with the weary politeness of a man doing an errand he did not want. "The cook needs hands." Dinah's name lived like a blessing in town kitchens. Silas had heard it. He frowned, weighing lie against risk, then made the mistake he'd been making for months. He trusted the shape of his suspicion more than the shape of the scene in front of him. "Show me your hands," he demanded of the father. The man lifted them. One shook. One held steadier than a man about to bolt. Silas leaned closer, hunting for guilt and finding exhaustion. "Go," he said, as if granting a favor, and stepped aside. They moved. 2 turns later, a different danger waited. Betrayal, the first real one in a year. Not a kitchen woman, not one of the trained hands. A man who owed Mr. Caldwell money and decided to pay it, and information slipped from a doorway and breathed the words that men who fear their own debts try to sell. Reward. He had watched the lane. He had counted shadows. He knew enough to hurt. He made for Mr. Caldwell's porch, where the planter sat with a cup and a worry. The man poured out his story. The cup went down hard. Silas was summoned, and this is where betrayal broke against a wall it did not expect. Mr. Caldwell, tired of Silas's ghosts, tired of costs without results, shaped by a wife who kept writing sentences he did not read, hesitated. He looked toward Ada's yard, where the lamps threw ordinary light. He said, "If you are wrong again, I will be the fool twice." Silas, stung, clattered into the lane with too many men and not enough sense. The betrayer smiled a poor man's smile. Ada's yard received the sound of coming trouble the way a drum receives a stick. Felt it first, then answered. Mira cut 2 knots, tied 1. Hester put her basket on the floor, set the newborn and mother behind the flour barrels, folded a blanket so it looked like laundry, and placed a wooden spoon where a hand could find it in the dark. Dinah, already at the back door with a bowl and cloth, blew out a candle and let the room be lit by the fire only. Kofi took his coil of chain to the gate and laid it across the post in a way that promised obedience, while being one breath from falling. Silas arrived with his men and his low lantern and his need to be right. He knocked with his knuckles like a gavel. Ada opened. "Again," she said, not unkindly. He pushed past. The men fanned. The lantern swung wild. It found nothing but a tidy room and a pot that smelled like stew without giving up its secrets. He reached for the ash box on instinct. It held ash. He put his hand on the flour barrels. Flour dusted his fingers like a rebuke. He looked at the ceiling, the corners, the floor. The baby's breath, 1, 2 holds, stayed tucked under linen and will. Mira counted silently a number that steadied heat and heart. Silas turned on Ada. "You think me a fool," he hissed. "No," she said, calm as a cool pan. "I think you are tired." The men behind him let go a breath. Tired is contagious. It makes even loyalty blink. He could feel his moments slipping and lunged for the back door. Kofi stood there, hand on the chain, as if it were an idea he might or might not use. "Gate," Silas said. Kofi lifted the chain. It slid off and coiled on the ground like a snake sleeping. The gate opened a hair and then stopped against a wedge no lantern would see. "Nothing here," Kofi said, not lying. Silas stared at him as if a different man would sprout from Kofi's face and confess. He left with the betrayer, dragging him to Mr. Caldwell as proof of activity. Mr. Caldwell, who had not wanted the night, dismissed them both with a flick of his hand that would cost him in other ways later, and spare him something tonight. On the porch, Mrs. Caldwell closed her diary and said nothing. Silence sometimes is an indictment, sometimes a promise, and sometimes both. They waited in Ada's yard until the dark remembered how to be kind again. Then the run resumed, short, precise, with breath counted not in fear but in readiness. At Dinah's, the pantry bed held the mother and child a last hour. Dinah hummed a tune that made the room taller. Jonah, at the door, watched the lane like a man who respects all the ways a plan can go wrong and has chosen to love it anyway. Kofi reset the chain. Hester repacked her baskets. Mira tied 2 knots back in, left 1 out. The route had changed for good. They reached the river at dawn's first pale, the color that makes a person forgive the night. Kojo waited with a boat that smelled like pine and the work of good hands. Elijah pointed them to a landing that would hold their weight. Abel took the far bank like wind doing a favor. Rose spoke to the boy in a voice that sounded like shade. The boat slid. The oars did their believing. The river performed its ancient task. On the other shore, the old road accepted feet as a friend accepts a hand, and that was the end of that run. No fireworks, no chase, only accuracy. The family moved south by days and nights measured the way a midwife measures labor. Breathe, hold, now. Wait, not yet now. When they reached the wall in the Blue Tuesday, the woman in the red scarf argued about figs until the commander got bored of trying to win. A door opened. St. Mateo's water flowed in a cup. Back north, the betrayer learned the cost of selling fear. Mr. Caldwell settled the debt he'd wanted paid and paid Silas off as well, with dismissal. "You made this place smaller," he said simply. "Small is unsafe." Silas packed his lantern and reports and walked the old road alone, muttering to trees that had done him no harm. He would leave his name in no one's story but his own. The priest added a line to his public list that anyone could read, and only some could understand. For travelers, some roads demand patience more than strength. He underlined patience. He underlined it again. The woman in the red scarf laughed when she read it and taught the boy a fourth tempo on the whistle. The one. That means joy but not too loud. News of small victories and near disasters braided themselves into a larger rope. In the fields, drums began to learn one another. Not loudly, not in parades, but in practice. 3 beats, then 2, then a stretch of quiet that meant gather. A roll that meant scatter. A syncopation that meant soon. Jonah heard them from the edge of a wood and felt the future step closer on steady feet. Kofi listened outside the smithy and felt the iron in his mouth sweeten. Hester wove a rim that meant when you are ready, we are. Mira ran her fingertips over the knots and knew she would someday tie a map farther than her eyes could see. Ada looked at her table. The knife, the bread, the bowls, and understood both the limitation and the power of a kitchen. You cannot end a world with stew. You can keep the people ending it alive. She sharpened the knife because edges dull. She set out bowls because work needs strength. She stood in a doorway at dusk and watched a line of sky turn the color of new copper and felt, in her bones, the slow completeness doing its work. The sealed records in Charleston stayed sealed for now. A clerk dusted the box and did not open it. A scholar sharpened a quill and wrote a treatise on trade that missed the human center by a mile. A child in a yard repeated a sentence because saying it out loud helps it find the right muscles. Justice burns slower than coal, but burns complete. That child would teach it to another, who would teach it to a third, and the air would keep carrying it for anyone whose ear had learned to listen. And then, because stories like this must end somewhere even when the work does not, the circle closed, not with a furnace and not with ash, but with morning light falling through leaves onto a road where footsteps were already receding. The family who had crossed slept in a room with a clean floor. The commander learned to leave chimneys alone. Mr. Caldwell paid more attention to silence. Silas's lantern went out in a place that did not care. Kojo hummed a tune to a dog and threw a crust just far enough. Dinah kneaded dough and added 3 slashes for readiness. Darius set down his hammer and flexed his shoulder against the rain. Kofi opened his hand and held nothing and everything in it. Tools, patience, work. Hester finished a basket that looked like market and carried escape. Mira tied one last knot and tucked the string away, not as a secret but as a readiness. The river did what rivers do, kept going. It remembered the scrape of a barrel, the hush of a boat, the whisper of a gate chain sliding free, the breath of a child sleeping behind flour barrels while men argued with their own failure in the next room. It remembered a kitchen where Cole learned a second lesson and a sentence spoken into heat and recorded in the long ledger of the living. Justice burns slower than coal, slower than anger, slower than rumor, slower than the brag of men who think they own time, but it burns complete. It moves in kitchens and lanes, in hymns and knots, in the tilt of a broom and the patience of a gate. It takes the shape of people who refuse to forget they are people. It makes the world, degree by stubborn degree, remember that the only real order is the one built on that fact. So we end here, not because the work is over, but because this chapter has come to its clean edge. The road runs on. The drums will speak. The sealed box will one day open and find the room already moved. And somewhere in a house that smells of stew and iron and river, A woman hums a tune from across the sea and sharpens a blade, not for vengeance now, but for bread, for rope, for whatever comes through the door, and the song carries the lesson forward without raising its voice. Slower than coal, but complete.